The soft moonlight was streaming through the window into the closed room. The girl looked at the night sky with kind eyes. The moon, through the lattice, illuminated the pensive face of a girl who was remembering an ancient belief. She looked at the shooting stars with a sinking heart, but doubts crept into her soul and never left her. Suddenly, there was a clang from the bars of the window bars. It was a surprise at this hour. There were nasty children's voices. They were shouting barbs and mean jokes. They were twins, bullies, and bullies. Brother and sister, a girl named Linu and a boy named Su. Aju immediately realized who it was. She could see their faces clearly in the moonlight. The obnoxious twins didn't stop. They kept teasing Aju, who was locked in the room. Su looked at Aju with evil eyes, plotting to hurt her more and more. Aju wanted to say something to Su, but what she saw with her eyes startled her and abruptly took away her speech. In front of her face, very close, was a wooden stick that Su held in his hand, intending to poke her with it like some wild animal. The twins learned the doctor's diagnosis first and came to Aju's house to taunt her. The first unexpected blow came straight to her heart. Aju couldn't tell whether it was more painful to be hit with a stick or to be told that her illness could not be cured. Aju fell on her hands in front of the twin bullies. A few drops of bright scarlet blood fell from her mouth. An intense pain pierced her from the inside. She couldn't breathe or move. The pain gripped her from the tips of her fingers to the top of her head. Linu and Su continued to mock and taunt. Such cruel games towards Aju, they found it very amusing. Su hit Aju on the back of her head with a wooden stick, while she gasped and her body convulsed in pain. The last few moments of coughing were just painful as hell. The pain was unbearable. I couldn't stand it. At some point, Aju became exhausted and fell on her side, without closing her eyes. It was as if she had lost consciousness. Linu and Su looked at her curiously. It seemed to them that she was no longer breathing. After realizing that perhaps Aju was no longer alive, the brother and sister ran home together joyfully. Lying on the floor, completely exhausted, Aju bitterly realized that the ancient belief meant nothing. There was weariness in her gaze, resentment. Her eyes were full of pain. She looked through the bars at the bright passing shooting star across the night sky. Aju wondered, looking for an excuse for the ancient belief, which was her salvation, her last straw, her only hope. There was the sound of unlocking doors. In the doorway stood the figure of the woman whom the evil bullies of the twins called Mom. She said the phrase with coldness and calculation, no pity or compassion. The cynical pragmatism of a man with a heart of stone. A vivid image appeared before Aju's eyes. It was as if for a moment she was in a fairy tale where she was loved and appreciated. Taking a heavy breath while opening her eyes, Aju shouted as loudly as she could. Standing up a little, Aju looked around at the unfamiliar terrain, not realizing what was going on around her. The phrases of Linu and Su's mother sounded in her head like a sentence. Quiet, calm, ruthless, and pragmatic. Looking at the night sky, dotted with bright stars, but without the bars of her prison, the girl clearly remembered the people close to her, remembered who she was and what her name was. Lying in a clearing of fragrant grass and fragrant flowers, looking up at the moonlight, Aju continued to reminisce about her life. She arranged the fragments of memory like puzzles of a single picture, not forgetting the ancient belief in which she believed so much. Aju heard some strange sounds, a quiet rustle approaching. Looking to the right, Aju saw two fiery glittering eyes in the pitch blackness. Her gaze, her eyes were a mixture of indifference, fear, and surprise. The predator crept up slowly but surely, and the moonlight showed the metallic hue of its fangs. The beast quickens its pace, the ground flying from under its clawed paws. It picks up speed, sensing the helplessness of its prey, anticipating its future feast. The beast's speed reached its limit. All the muscles in the entire body of the beast tensed up, apogee in a lethal leap towards the victim, with sharp claws, leaping with an open maw studded with fearsome sharp fangs. Aju braced herself for her doom. Suddenly, a bright flash in the sky, the earth was lit up in a blaze of light, and right at the moment of the jump, something truly bright, terrible, but beautiful fell from the night sky onto the terrible beast. A bright, blinding flash illuminated everything around him. From the sudden horror, the beast froze in flight, still unable to understand what had happened to him, who had ended his existence. In an instant, the temperature spiked to the extreme. The heat instantly ignited the air and incinerated the body of the fearsome predator. The glowing flash turned him into nothing, a handful of hulls and ashes. Aju stared in amazement at the large metal cylinder that appeared in front of her. There was steam coming from the capsule, and there were some glowing symbols on it. With fearful wonder, the girl's intelligent eyes examined this strange large object, a large cylinder that would be a capsule. Had the ancient belief turned out to be true? Aju wondered. Suddenly, the object began issuing commands, one by one, and releasing compressed cold air. The indicators on the body of the capsule began to shimmer with green-blue colors and change their shape. The colors changed from one shade to another, alternating between them. Finally, a large stream of cold air was pushed forcefully out of the pressurized capsule. A voice heralded the launch. And around Eiju, in the air, various translucent bright pictures appeared, which seemed to surround him from all sides. Eiju froze in silent delight, in awe and wonder. Her face and intelligent eyes lit up with light from the large unknown object that had opened, repeating part of the command from the capsule. I thought Eiju, trying to see and understand what they depicted. Mustering up her courage, Eiju quietly brought her hand to one of these pictures and tried to touch it with her finger. There was a look of surprise in her intelligent eyes. It was unusual for her. What was happening was simply the height of fantasy. Suddenly, the silhouette of a funny blue face that looked like a big saucer appeared in front of her and greeted her. Eiju was frightened, not understanding what the unusual stranger wanted from her. She started screaming. After a little while, calming down a bit but still just as wary, Eiju asked the unusual stranger. In response, the stranger pretended to think hard and closed his eyes and glowed with a faint blue light. The stranger introduced himself and explained to Eiju who he really was. With a dumbfounded expression on her face, Eiju interjected, repeating the words of the Matrix guide. The guide calmly told her his intentions. But Eiju did not believe him. Thinking it was all a prank, she turned her back to the guide and began to stride confidently. Keeping his cool, the guide threw one phrase in her direction, hoping it would catch her eye. And he hit the target. Eiju was interested, but she didn't show it. Then, suddenly the guide, without ceremony, shouted at her, telling what was her secret. With very great surprise, she asked him, "How does he know that? It's not like anyone knows." The tour guide gave her a sly wink. After she showed him her interest, he made her a good offer. Eiju was showing the guide her doubt and mistrust with her whole look, trying to find a trick. The guide explained to her the reason for his choice, and why he was here. Standing near the capsule, he pointed out the site of the predator's death, and his explanation was, to put it mildly, very unusual. Without thinking long, the guide quickly told Eiju about his problem. He hoped that she would be able to help him. She, standing with her back to him, was silent, not giving any sign. And he just kept talking and talking. He kept talking and talking, just like he never stopped. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Just silence, nothing more. Suddenly, on his own, Eiju had a coughing fit. It was just like that time in the room with the bars. She covered her mouth with the palm of her hand, but it was getting stronger. The attacks of pain were a terrible pounding ache. The coughing subsided. Eiju took her hand away and saw scarlet bloodstains on her palm. There was more blood this time. Observing this picture from the side, Gid warily asked her. Such symptoms were familiar to him. Eiju told him everything she knew. There was no whining in her voice, no hint of how unfair life was. Suddenly, the guide reassured her. He gave her hope with his words. It was like a lifeline for her. The overall coating of the capsule begins to open. The system adjusts to the new mode. A compartment with a special door appears at the top. It was well made and did not compromise the tightness of the hull. There is a click. The door of the upper compartment opens and a transparent vessel with a glowing liquid flies out. Eiju holds this transparent vessel gently in his hands and examines the luminous liquid. Her intelligent and inquisitive eyes reflect the glow from the vessel. She wonders if it will really help her. Is it really true? The guide explained to her what it was, and what it's for. She needs to use it. Smiling slyly, he tries to sway Eiju into helping himself, promising her a generous reward. She suspects something. There's something inside her that's bugging her. She's looking for a catch. It can't be like this. She finally gives in to his entreaties, and does everything the guide tells her to do. Eiju tries his best to open the jar, but something goes wrong. In her helplessness and frustration, she complains to the guide, and the guide irritably explains to her what to do. After opening the jar, she empties it quickly and greedily, every last drop, which can't help but surprise the guide. After drinking it all down, Eiju looks at the empty jar in her hands with surprise and asks him. Suddenly she feels uncomfortable. Her own body begins to react in a strange way. She sharply clutches the empty vessel in her hands and throws it to the ground. The Matrix guide, seeing this reaction, starts shouting. The result surprised him. He knew exactly what medicine to give. Eiju lay in the clearing on her back, thinking she was giving up her spirit. She was already humbly preparing for her last breath. The Matrix guide, thinking that he had harmed her, suddenly began to wonder with horror. Opening her eyes and sighing heavily, she tried to get as much fresh air into her lungs as possible. Lifting up slightly and resting both hands on the ground, she slowly came to her senses and felt more alive than ever before. Suddenly, her palms were engulfed in bright blue flames. This surprised Eiju. The flame was as bright as the light of a shooting star in the night sky, but it didn't burn her at all. New sensations came over her like waves, one after another. And it was extraordinary. Her body felt completely different. She began to thank Gid for his help, for his healing. She was very grateful to him. The countdown timer started abruptly, out of the blue. Only 10 seconds. Glancing at the timer report, the Matrix guide begins to plead with Aju to agree to his proposal. She's confused. He appeals to her humanity and her sense of gratitude, that she shouldn't leave him in the lurch because he helped her. At a loss, she doesn't know what to do. Decisions made in haste are the worst. Meanwhile, the timer continues to count down. The seconds are rushing away like water. She makes a decision to help Guide quickly. He tells her what to do. Aju puts her hands together and makes her fateful decision. She utters a fateful wish. The Matrix Guide exclaims joyfully. He rejoices, for he is still alive. The Matrix capsule rises up and illuminates the entire clearing with a bright light. For a moment, night becomes day. The single capsule of the Matrix disintegrates into many constituent, brightly colored parts that soar high into the sky. These parts turn into round objects of unknown metal and concentrate all the energy of the main cell of the Matrix. They soar high into the sky above Aju's head, going far away to the stars. Aju has the last fragment, and she hears the system's command, and the voice disappears. An oddly shaped, round, golden-colored object remains in her palms. Peering at her new gift in the palms of her hands, she says aloud with surprise. She heard a familiar voice from behind her. It wasn't too loud, but it was familiar, and it sounded far away. She recognized that voice. It was the voice of Aunt Yi, who had been walking around the clearing at night looking for her. Auntie called to her again and again, hoping to hear her response. She looked left and right, trying to see her niece in the clearing. She called out loudly to her aunt so she could hurry over to her, staring intently at the little golden bell in her hands, marveling at its ordinariness. Clasped her hands together so as not to lose keep and hide her new gift from view. Auntie, at last, after a long night of searching and calling, found her favorite niece. Breakfast has never tasted so good. It's so delicious. She takes another bite of the yummy treat for herself. She reaches out to take an extra bite. I have an appetite. It's like it's all cooked just for me. Aju, with satisfied bright eyes and a joyful face, gorges on everything in both cheeks. Auntie is pleasantly surprised and pleased to see her niece in good health. She is very pleased that her niece has a good appetite. She hugs and cries for her niece, but these tears are not tears of grief, but of great joy. Auntie leaves her niece in the kitchen for a while, and smiling happily, she says to her, the kitchen doors close quietly. The click of the lock is barely audible. It's good to be healthy. It's good to be loved. It's good to be needed. From under the table appeared a small, handsome, skittish boy with a mischievous look. He sits down in Aju's arms and starts bouncing happily in her lap. The cousin sits on Aju's lap. He smiles happily. Aju asks her cousin. He turns his head to her and looks her in the eye. She strokes her cousin's head with her gentle and warm hand, like his own mother, and asks him to do her bidding. Shuan joyfully jumps off Aju's knee and runs toward the kitchen exit. Resva jumps through the doorway and shouts to her little sister. Now she's alone with her thoughts. Now it's quiet and you can get some peace of mind. She slips her left hand into her pocket and takes a bell in the palm of her hand. He rises above the kitchen table, begins to glow blue, and turns to him. The little spirit tells Aju that there are no restrictions for him. She looks at him in surprise. Aju still can't get used to her new status and doesn't know what to do. What to do? The little spirit, smiling slyly, begins his story. A blue-colored holographic panel appears before her gaze, showing the characteristics. Then he goes into detail about the criteria, and also the evaluation scale. She looks at her picture on the holographic panel, but she can't understand everything right away. The first thing that sets her off, and the first thing that bothers her. She asks the little spirit a question. The little spirit sighs heavily and answers her. Realizing that no one else will tell her he is patient, the little spirit begins to explain in detail. It starts with the first indicator. The second indicator is also important, and not insignificant, and people also value it very, very much. Then the little spirit tells the principles of collecting points and distributing them, and also the place where these points are stored. Aju asks the little spirit bewilderedly, looking at him with his intelligent eyes. The little spirit makes a little comparison and suggests that Aju practice it herself. A bright flash appears in the air, and a hologram with bright blue-colored glasses appears. Everything around it glows. Aju is terribly angry with the little spirit. There's no limit to her resentment. After a little while, she calms down, and the little spirit looks at her and listens to her answer. Then he tells her some very interesting news. Smiling slyly, the little spirit explains that the points can also be used to their advantage. This cheers Aju up, and she immediately asks the little spirit if her wish can be fulfilled. With a smarmy look on his face, little spirit began to awkwardly make excuses. Joe's little cousin came running into the kitchen again. He suddenly heard foreign voices. Looking at his cousin in surprise, Shuan Luo also noticed a small spirit hovering in the air near his new mistress. Aju looked at her cousin with a frightened look. She started shouting his name in horror. Awkwardly excusing herself, with a goofy grin on her face, she began to explain herself very quickly. Looking at Aju with awkwardness because there was much she didn't understand or know, the little spirit explained to her with a stony expression. She quickly turned her head in his direction and half-whispered in a small spirit's voice. She turned her head quickly in his direction and half-whispered to the little spirit. Little Shuan Luo, holding onto the door jamb, stared at his cousin in astonishment, eyes wide open. Awkwardly holding his head with his hand, with a goofy grin, Aju says it's okay, don't pay attention. From behind, in the hallway, someone from the back crept up on Shuan, holding a large wooden stick in his right hand. The corridor was poorly lit compared to the kitchen, and someone had already brought a wooden stick over the back of Shuan's head. Sensing something the last moment before impact, Shuan turned around abruptly. There was a thud, and he was hit hard with a wooden weighty stick on his head. Ju heard a shrill child's cry close in the kitchen doorway from across the corridor. With horror in her eyes, she realized it was her cousin screaming. Terrible thoughts flashed through her mind. She saw his small body in the lighted kitchen doorway and quickly ran to him. Taking his head in her hands, she began shouting her brother's name loudly, but he was unconscious. Shuan was moaning heavily, with his eyes closed, and a lot of blood was oozing from the large wound on his temple, which wouldn't stop flowing. Aju heard caustic and angry speeches in the dark hallway. They were very familiar voices to her. She discerned silhouettes. They were the bully twins Ling Yu and Su, who were smiling viciously. Ling Yu, with a sneer, snickered at Aju. She's trying to hurt her and humiliate her. Su started poking his big wooden stick at Aju, muttering vile things. But suddenly, Aju easily held the stick with her one hand. It was as if she had great strength. Su didn't expect this at all and stared in surprise. Where did she get such strength from? Just a short while ago, she was sickly. She looked angrily at the twins and told them, warning that there would be retribution. There would be no permissiveness. Righteous anger and indignation boiled in her eyes. A terrible anger enveloped her. The air was filled with bursts of strong spiritual energy. It spread in waves in all directions. The little spirit heard the alarms of the Matrix system. They were very strong, and it scared him badly. He remembered in detail his landing in the Matrix capsule, in the clearing where Aju had been. He realized the reason for his landing. The bursts of strong spiritual energy kept getting stronger and stronger. The little spirit looked at his new mistress and realized what was really going on. He was very glad that he had made the right choice. Now, with his own eyes, he would see what she was capable of. Aju's concentration was increasing. Her eyes clearly read inexorability, inevitability, and righteous anger. The first thing the blob of energy did was to summon Aju a large bird from the garden. Then a snake was summoned from a large tree branch in the forest. Then a frog from a nearby pond was summoned. A great many animals, birds, and amphibians came to Aju's call in the dark corridor. They kept coming and coming. The twin bullies began to speak fearfully. They had not expected such a turn of events. And the eyes of all of her summoned animals were directed towards Ling Yu and Su. They all seemed to be waiting for a command from the one who had summoned them. Aju calmly and firmly ordered all of them. No mercy, only retribution. And all the animals rushed furiously to attack the twins. They began to scream and shout in fear, with tears in their eyes. Aunt Yi, standing with a tray of food, saw her niece. She couldn't believe her eyes. The tray of food slipped from her hands. The entire contents crashed to the floor. Aju looked up in surprise at her aunt's shouting. Something guilty was visible in her eyes. In the main hall there were cries and lamentations. Of course it was all fake and untrue. Su was showing small wounds on his arm and tattered new clothes. Ling Yu was sobbing. She couldn't stop. She's no stranger to pretense. The concubine with her bully twin children came running to the master of the house to complain about Aju's act. And behind stood Aju next to Aunt Yi and little Shuan. Aju was so furious, no one had ever seen her so angry. Aunt Yi was holding Shuan in her arms. The wound on his head was carefully bandaged. He had lost all his strength. The mom of the bully of twins started wailing and blaming Aju for everything that happened. Aju could barely contain her anger. Only the presence of the master of the house stopped her. The voice of the gentleman silenced everyone. He imperiously signaled that it was time to end the whole show. The master asked his son for his opinion. He had faith in his sound mind and logic. His son was well educated. Zhang Luo looked at Zhang's mother, calmly replied to his father that he didn't believe her. Mr. Luo interrogated his son. He asked another question. To his father's question, Zhang Luo made a valid argument. Then he explained to his father the cause and effect of the actions of Mother Zhan and her children. He gave a lot of reasons. Mr. Luo listened to his son and passed judgment. Aju looks at the Lord with a shudder to hear what punishment awaits her. Zhang Luo started to interrupt his father, but his father interrupted him sharply. Aju shouted sharply, unable to contain herself, no matter what. She angrily asked Mr. Luo while looking at him, forgetting who is the master in this manner. To which Mr. Luo calmly and nonchalantly replied to Aju. There was a note of strength in his voice. Aju, boldly and bravely standing in front of Mr. Luo's eyes, tried to prove her innocence and made a solid argument. This confused Mr. Luo a bit. He was dumbfounded by the Aju's boldness or insolence. Auntie Yi, holding little Shuan, looking at Aju, couldn't believe her eyes. This surprised the son of the master of the manor, but Aju didn't perceive anyone anymore. The little spirit told Aju about the changes and new arrivals. She thought quietly to herself, if she'd made a mistake, it's the owner of the house. But then Jan's mother stepped in. She had a very unfriendly look on her face, like a snake. She squealed, and at just the right moment, in front of Lord Luo, told of Aju's affliction. Mr. Luo was terrified and speechless for a moment. He didn't know what to say. With frightened eyes, he quickly asked Aju, and he was scared out of his wits. Scabies is a deadly disease. She replied with a guilty look and tried to justify herself somehow. But before he could finish listening to her, Mr. Luo shouted at the top of his voice. Then the master of the manor turned to his son and angrily asked him. Aju, looking at Mr. Luo with her eyes, said loudly. Her right hand began to be covered in blue flames. She could barely contain herself. A new surge of energy was building up. The little spirit began to think anxiously to himself. What would happen next, how events would unfold. But then the verbal altercation and tension was extinguished by a quiet old lady's question. Aju turned towards the old lady and looking at her said. The old woman walked over to Aju, put her hand on her shoulder and spoke. Mr. Luo awkwardly tried to warn the old lady who was his mother, to which the old woman responded harshly and rudely to her son, without regard for his authority. Mr. Luo was a little embarrassed by this answer, and fell silent. Mom is sacred. It can't be helped. The old woman began to tell Aju with warmth and tenderness, so she wouldn't be frightened. There is no deception. But Aju, sensing some kind of trick, asked her directly. She has a lot of courage. Understanding her mood, the old lady calmly and wisely explained to her all the consequences of talking to Luo-san like this today. Hugging Aju, the old woman asks him to trust her. After all, no one wants to harm her. With a pleading look in her eyes, she looked at the old woman, ready to cry. But then she smiled and was glad that her grandmother had told her. Stepping away from her, the old woman headed towards her son, Mr. Luo, saying. The old woman walks with a groan to Mr. Luo's chair. Her son courteously gives her his seat. Seated in a chair, the old woman gives instructions in a commanding voice, what to do about Aju's illness. In deference to his mother and her wisdom, Mr. Luo bows his head to her. Aunt Yi walks over to Aju and touches her hand, showing that it's time for them to leave. As she's about to leave, the old woman calls out to her, saying her last words of instruction. With a contented, wise, and smiling face, the old lady tells her. Aju looks at her and tears begin to flow down her cheeks. Tears of gratitude. She cries, but still speaks words of gratitude for the old lady. Mother Jang and her bully twin children laughingly say nasty things toward Aju. Auntie, her son, and her niece leave the main hall of Luo Manor with the bully Shu shouting after them. It's night, the moon is in the sky. Everything is ready for Aju and her loved ones to embark on a new journey. Aju sits down in her wagon and looks at the other carriage that will be carrying everything they need for them. But who is riding in it, she doesn't know. She takes the bell out of her pocket and looks at it. It's like an outlet for her. Aju asks the little spirit a question. She's waiting for support in return. She's having a hard time. With a cheerful smile, the little spirit answers his mistress. He cheers her up and calms her down. Aju looks at the little spirit. He looks like a blue cloud. Suddenly, there's a sudden cry. A servant runs towards the cart with all his might. A servant holds up a wooden chest for Aju as a gift. Aju sets the chest on her lap and looks at it thoughtfully. By gently opening the lid of the chest, she saw the silver that filled the chest to the brim. Auntie Yi moved closer to Aju and said, Mr. Luo's son stood in the window. The window was half open, and his face was almost invisible. With longing and sorrow, he watched and thought of Auntie Yi Aju leaving. Aju cried at the thought of Master Luo's son. His generosity touched her to the core. Bitter tears rolled down her cheeks, and she tried to wipe them away with her hand. But suddenly the tears stopped flowing, and Aju thought resolutely. Her hand glowed with a faint blue fire of power. It's just beginning. The wagons are traveling down the road. It's pouring rain. Aju mentally questions the little spirit. The little spirit answers her easily and simply. No tricks or subterfuge. Aju can't understand what meaning the little spirit is putting into that word. The little spirit explains to her in more detail. To make it easier for her to understand everything, he cites the recent situation with the scandal in the main hall of Luo Manor as an example. The little spirit says this is just the beginning. There will be more and better things to come. Aju's eyes sparkled with awe. After all, she liked what she had heard very much. She wrinkled her nose at the pleasant sensation of being different, that she was special. The little spirit asked Aju to see if she felt a change in her body. She thought about it, listened, and realized to herself with surprise. There was a great power within her. Aju listens to the little spirit with closed eyes and a satisfied face. while Aunt Yi gingerly looks at her niece talking to herself. Ju opened her eyes, peeked out of the wagon, and wanted to talk to the horses. She starts shouting and waving to the horses. The coachman of the wagon looks at her in surprise. The two horses are talking to each other in surprise. Ju waves happily and talks to the horses. She smiles even though she's half drenched in rain. Ju, who is pleased with herself, smiles and glows with happiness. Aunt Yi can't understand what's going on. She looked affectionately at her niece and asked her tactfully. Smiling, Ju replied to her aunt that everything will be fine. The main thing is that she's with them. Peering at the wagon behind Ju had some questions. These questions she asked her Auntie E. She was very interested. There were 4 people in the second cart, clean and neatly dressed in identical dresses, 2 girls and their mother, and an older woman. Auntie warned her niece about the last passenger. Ju looked at her aunt apprehensively and asked her again, should she be afraid? Suddenly, the little spirit heard an alarm. The Matrix's security defense system had been triggered. He immediately told Ju about it and couldn't contain his excitement and horror. She looked at him gravely and interrogated him. The little spirit began to scream as hard as it could at its new mistress as it could not delay. Looking at him worriedly, Ju quickly calmed him down. She immediately warned her aunt of the impending danger, but she looked at her incredulously. Ju screamed as loud as she could. Aunt Yi was stunned. She looked at her with frightened eyes and didn't know what to say in response. Auntie tried to gather her thoughts. She thought the best thing to do in this situation, right now, was to comfort her niece. She gently stroked her head and tried to say something kind to her. But in response, Ju jumped out of the wagon like a scalded woman, screaming as she went. She sharply blocked the path of the wagon. She crossed the road and started shouting at the horses. The horses barely stopped in front of her. She would have been run over in a heartbeat. Senior Wang gave admonishment for Ju, ostensibly caring about her condition. Ju's eyes turned gleamy and angry, and she abruptly interrupted Elder Wang's advice. Senior Wang looked at Ju in bewilderment as she sat in the second cart and quickly fell silent. Ju quickly turned to the little spirit for advice and help. Without thinking, she quickly traded the points she had left to save her loved ones. The horses felt the irresistible force and rumbled on the spot and began to beat their hooves. This force caused all 4 horses of the 2 wagons to turn immediately to the opposite side of the road. Auntie leaned out of the carriage and began to exclaim. The horses turned around and did not start galloping in the opposite direction. Even the coachman could not control them. Auntie began to shout and rebuke Ju, not realizing what was happening now. Meanwhile, Ju asked the little spirit with a focused look forward. With horror answering her, the little spirit said, "Take care and prepare to face the elements." A gigantic column of water was heading towards Ju, sweeping away and washing away everything in its path. It covered Ju completely. Only her face was visible from the water. Leaning out of the rapidly departing carriage, Aunt E shouted, while underwater convulsively Ju called out to her assistant. He helped her as much as he could. He worried about his new mistress and gave her advice. Ju saw a rescue log that was not far from her. She started paddling toward the log as hard as she could. Despite the steep flow of water, she wasted a lot of energy. At last she grasped the log and sighed with relief. It was very easy for her. In my thoughts I caught myself thinking not only about myself, but also about my close relatives. The little spirit began to frantically cry out to its young mistress. They were swimming swiftly toward a steep cliff, so steep that the falling water made a great rumble and noise. Both little spirit and Ju were unstoppable panic. The cliff actually seemed like a dangerous waterfall with protruding sharp rocks. Ju was flying upside down, and it seemed to her that everything around her was terribly slowed down. As she fell and approached the surface of the water, she asked herself one question. Terror and fear gripped her. She braced herself for the worst. The last moment she felt someone suddenly pick her up and prevented her from falling and breaking. She looked up in surprise at the forward-looking guy who held her tightly with his left hand. Finally, they both landed on the ground. The boy held her tightly so she wouldn't fall into the water. Ju thanked her savior, and that gratitude was evident in her eyes. In response to her words of gratitude, the boy only sighed heavily. Blood oozed from his stomach wound. He covered it with his hand. Ju saw his wound and turned to the little spirit. Suddenly behind her, she listened to the crackling of small wooden knots and a bestial growl. Ju and her savior were surrounded by a pack of wild wolves. The largest wolf with a battle-red coloring on his muzzle came closest. The wolves came closer and closer, and they growled aggressively, anticipating the taste of their prey. The largest wolf approached Ju, baring its fangs. At the last moment, Ju's savior struck with all his last strength at the large wolf and threw it back. The large wolf flew so far away that it crashed into a tree and hit his back. Savior Ju stood motionless after the blow he had dealt to the wolf. That's it. He's exhausted. He's starting to fall to the ground. Ju cried out and picked him up. She stopped him from hitting the ground. Her hero rescuer lies unconscious. His breathing is barely audible. She's amazed at what this guy did. She's never seen anyone try to save her before. She turns to a small spirit for help. but the spirit gives her a disappointing prognosis. What's more, he warns her that you can't spend all the points without repercussions. Seeing the wolves approaching, she wondered to herself. The wolves are getting closer and closer. They are angry and hungry. Their eyes are terrible and their teeth are razor sharp. Suddenly it hit Eiju. She turned to the wolf leader lying near the tree. In her last hope, she asked him a question. The very possibility of a human talking to wolves made the packmaster terribly angry, and he answered her sharply. Eiju calmly warns the leader, showing him that he's not afraid of him at all. The ringleader is very angry at this tone and threats from potential prey. She's just playing with fire. Not realizing the danger she's in. Eiju points to the wolf's wounded paw. The paw has a very bad appearance. The wound is big. With frustration and anger, the ringleader answered her. He knew full well he was vulnerable now, but he tried to hide it. To which she asks a simple and logical question to the ringleader. Continuing to develop his thought further, asks him the following uncomfortable question. The wolves eyed her warily and growled, watching the conversation between the human and their leader. With disbelief, the ringleader asks Eiju. Not understanding why she's helping him, she confidently offers her terms, knowing she's right, and that everyone benefits. And in return for his help, he asks the leader for his freedom. The ringleader, grinning, looks at her and says, "The law of the strong is the law of nature." Eiju looks at his savior, and touching his head says, Blue flames encompass Eiju's body. Her eyes shine and radiate strength. She turns to the wolf leader. I would like to ask the little spirit to make an immediate tally of her remaining points. Watching the new mistress help the animal, little spirit has some interesting thoughts. The little spirit is a little dreamy. The new mistress has a lot of potential. The ringleader looks at his bandage on his paw and listens to Eju's words. She tells the ringleader what to do and how to treat the wound to get it back to normal as quickly as possible. The leader speaks to Eiju with respect and treats her as an equal now, which has to be earned. And it's not easy. It's raining and all the silver wolves welcome a new pack ally with a howl. The little spirit is happy to inform his mistress he unexpected receipts. She looks with joyful, sparkling eyes at the glittering bell that floats above her head. She's as happy as a child. She didn't expect such a surprise. She didn't expect a gift like this. The little spirit explains to her why she has received such a reward. She, smiling, closes her eyes and begins to squint. It feels so good to do good. Suddenly, she abruptly remembers her savior who helped her. He lies on the ground in the rain, completely exhausted. She tries to bring him to his senses with words. The little spirit turns to its mistress, seeing the futility of action, and it's very hard for him to talk about it. He values human life. Eiju looks at the little spirit with frightened eyes. Eiju began to shake her savior and exclaim, She doesn't believe he's dead. The little spirit tries to talk sense into his new mistress, but she doesn't hear him at all. She turns to the little spirit and asks him to help save this guy. The little spirit is riddled with surprise at the unusual behavior of his new mistress. After all, it's a waste of energy to waste on a stranger. Eiju is in a hurry, and she's pushing the little spirit. Rather, every second counts. His life is on the line. He tells her it'll be done, although the price for saving this guy is not small in his opinion. Eiju is just so angry. Such calculations just made her so angry. The little spirit shows her a hologram with a table. He's also angry with his new mistress in return, and he shows her the items on the chart. And so the little spirit dictates to her step by step what she must do. Eiju was embarrassed and a little dumbfounded, showing her shyness. The little spirit began to lash out at Eiju and shouted, There's no time to hesitate. You're the one who asked for help. She carefully unbuttoned her savior's clothes and took a quick look at the wound. The guy's side was completely torn up. Looks like he lost a lot of blood. Eiju was not the least bit frightened. She'd never done this before. She'd never given first aid before. She took a part of her dress and with a sharp movement tore a flap of fabric from it. She diligently bandaged her savior's wound with torn cloth. The result was a secure bandage. It fit the boy's torso well. She, wiping the sweat from her forehead, was exhausted. She'd used up a lot of energy. Her hands were completely out of control. The little spirit commanded her, do exactly what he says, immediately. Frantically turning her head left and right, she tried to find her. She suddenly heard the voice of the wolf leader. He was courteous and calm. He offered her his help and the services of a guide. Eiju hesitated. The ringleader's condition was not the best, and how he would be able to help her in this case, she didn't understand. But he objected, insinuating that she couldn't do it alone. Glancing at the exhausted boy, she answers the wolf leader in agreement. Wolf paws pounded on the road, kicking up dust from the ground. The leader of the silver wolves put Eiju and the wounded guy on horseback. They galloped toward the mineral spring. They arrived at the location, as promised by the leader of the silver wolves. The wounded guy was laid on his back in front of the spring. There was no one around. Eiju thanked the ringleader and smiled. She didn't expect that. The ringleader replied that he was not to be thanked. An ally of the pack is not a stranger. As she left, the leader of the silver wolves told her that he was ready to come to her aid at her first call. The little spirit called out to Aju, "We need to use the waters of the spring." She took a piece of new cloth from her dress. She dipped it in the waters of the mineral spring and wiped the boy's face. The exhausted guy's face was covered with drops of mineral water. Looking at his blank face, she was a little surprised. The little spirit again commanded Aju what she should do, but she didn't quite understand him well, what he wanted from her. Such terms were new to her. The little spirit provided her with instructions. First aid to the injured. Embarrassed again, she tried to talk the little spirit out of the idea, but the little spirit yelled at her properly and told her to hurry up. All purple with embarrassment and shame, she hardly agreed to the little spirit's demands. She touched her lips to his, and the little spirit just came to be furious at her actions. She began reading and parsing the instructions from the holographic panel again. Aju makes a second attempt now, breathing air into his lungs. The little spirit cheers her up and tells her she's on the right track. After a while, they started yelling furiously at each other. The little spirit grumbled unhappily and said irritably, "Last chance to capitalize on points earned." The tips of the index fingers on both of his wife's hands lit up and sparks came from them. The little spirit again gives instructions. A holographic panel appears and shows the location of the force application on the guy's body. She looks at the little spirit with disbelief and warns him. Powerful discharge of electricity all over the guy's body. Electric waves traveling back and forth across the surface. The little spirit watches in anticipation, thinking its own thoughts. Awkward moment of silence. It feels like something bad is about to start. Once again, they start yelling at each other like crazy, claiming things against each other. But their argument is interrupted by a slight cough. The kid's awake. He's showing signs of life. The guy starts coughing harder and harder. Aju quickly asks him how he's feeling, but he doesn't answer, only coughs in response. She commands the little spirit to help immediately. Him, no matter how many points are spent. The little spirit transmits energy to the guy to support his condition. Once energized, the guy falls into a deep sleep. He just falls into a deep sleep. The young hostess asks her assistant what happened to the guy. Both breathed a sigh of relief. The hardest part was over. It was like a mountain had fallen from their shoulders. The little spirit asked Aju, "What's the reason for treating this guy this way?" Aju answered the spirit thoughtfully. Aju thoughtfully replied to the spirit, remembering all the times the guy had saved her life. The little spirit was very surprised at the logic of his new mistress. They had a chance to take a safe rest and regain their strength. And they did it to me right on the shore of the lake with mineral water. There was bright greenery around and sunlight illuminated everything around. The place is just beautiful. With heavy footsteps, change was coming. Real masters, fearless and mysterious. Moon in a starry sky. A fire is lit by the lake. Aju says to the little spirit. Seeing no problem, he answers her. She turned her head toward the guy and got a little embarrassed. She made her decision and walked away from the parking lot. Embarrassed, she told the little spirit to turn away immediately. The fire was crackling on the logs, lighting up the whole place. Heavy footsteps and the metallic clanking of armor can be heard. The month is so clear, the stars are so bright, the clouds are passing by and everything is so calm. Aju looks up at the evening sky and wonders. Suddenly she hears a noise. It sounds like grass rustling under her feet. She got angry at the little spirit and told him to get out. He responded by making excuses. Then she raised her tone and asked. Aju turned her head and looked toward the campfire. The three warriors encircled the boy's body. They were very surprised at his discovery. The little spirit gives good advice for the new mistress. One of the three warriors leaned over to the boy and checked to see if he was alive or not. They looked at the neat dressing and his general condition. The other had a confused expression on his face, looking at the guy lying on the ground near the fire. He spoke aloud words of gratitude. Abruptly, he turned toward the trees and heard some rustling. He was very surprised. Maybe there's an enemy spy hiding or an ambush. He listened suspiciously to the sounds and readied his weapon. He went to the tree behind which Aju was hiding and drew his sword. Hiding carefully, she thought. That's it, they're going to find her. And then a rabbit jumped out from behind the bushes. The warrior looked up and saw the fleeing animal. The other two of his squad called out to him. The warrior strode toward the campfire with his fellows. Aju and the little spirit brushed the cold sweat off their foreheads. She quietly peeked out of the tree and realized. The guy comes to his senses and the other warriors help him. It turns out that this is not just a guy, but a general. The squad leader asks him how he got here. The general replies, "He's relieved. He's alive. He can walk." A younger warrior with a confused look asked the general a question. He told everything he remembered. All the details were minute. All three of them were stunned and embarrassed. The chief said something nonsensical, and not the smartest among them gave out the following assumption, which was very much like a silly joke, for which the other two gave him a spoonful and calmed him down. He is, after all, in the presence of a general. Well, he quickly, and most importantly, correctly began to justify himself. Aju watched the other warriors help the general and tend to him. Little Spirit and Aju looked at each other and exchanged glances. Relieved, Aju told the little spirit that she was morally relieved and they set off to find Auntie Yi. The little spirit offered to stay until dawn. Need to rest in a safe place. Nu Aju smilingly contradicted him. She's not tired and we should look for Auntie. At these words, the little spirit became proud and laughed, and the two of them went on a search through the woodlands. The ringing of a bell, small and golden. The general walks with his 3 warriors. He stops and looks back. His gaze falters. The general looks at the night forest thicket and ponders. There will still be a chance to meet, and there will still be a chance to see each other. A little spirit, his new mistress, walks through the forest at night in search of his auntie, and an awkward moment of silence. Something bad is brewing again. And then they start yelling at each other again. Like crazy. Aju watches the little spirit hopefully, and he does the math. Aju grits his teeth and says yes, and decides to resupply another time. She looks determinedly at her subordinate and loudly states to him. You could tell from just the look and expression on the little spirit's face that he was tired. A holographic panel with a map appears in front of Aju's face. The little spirit explains to her the details of the map provided. The red dot is pretty far away, not that far according to the map. Aju stares intently at this landmark without taking his eyes off it. The new mistress addresses the little spirit. She knew how he would feel about her request. She says, smiling, that she could use some refreshment before traveling. The little spirit does the calculating and recharging. Aju smiles contentedly and praises the little spirit. It's a beautiful sunrise. Rays of the sun rise from the crowns of the trees. Auntie both exclaims and asks everyone else. In response, Senior Wang says to her. Her face is very unhappy. And the other servants try not to contradict her. With her old hands, she reaches out to Shuan Luo. But she is blocked by 2 sisters. They try to stand up for Auntie Yi and Schuan. With a sense of gratitude, Auntie looks at the 2 little girls. Moving her old lips, Senior Wang muttered, and abruptly grabbed her left hand around Suer's throat. And with her right hand, she took hold of Yulo's throat. The older Wang, holding the girls by the throat, started yelling at them, and she threw them aside on the ground and told Auntie to carry out her instructions. Suddenly, words sounded like thunder from behind Senior Wang. She was horrified, turned around, and saw Aju embraced by blue flames. She couldn't understand or make sense of what was going on, and it scared her a lot. In front of her stood an angry Aju, waves of blue flames rippling across her. Auntie both looked at her pityingly and exclaimed her name. She began asking her how she was feeling and examining her with her eyes from top to bottom and bottom to top. Auntie took hold of Aju's cheek, but the latter smilingly reassured her. Both of them looked at Shuan. He is unconscious. Auntie said regretfully that her son was not well. There was a fever and chills all over his face. The little boy is not well. Suddenly, Fatted looked at Senior Wang with an angry look. Senior Wang to the side pretended to kneel down and pray. She was afraid that Ozil would punish her severely for treating the twins badly and becoming willful toward little Shuan and Auntie Yi. Aju and Auntie both looked at Senior Wang with a stern gaze. The cart, clanking its hooves, merrily drove into the city gates of Liao City. Leaning out of the cart window, Aju tried to get a better look, and then turning to her aunt asked her. Auntie Yi carefully answered her. Everything will be all right. A gray-haired grandfather with a neat beard and mustache began to cough. The coughing ended, and he began to wail, and expressing his displeasure. He stood on the mountain near a tree and saw 2 wagons passing down the main street of the town. Clacking their hooves, the horses kicked up dust from the road as well. Shaman Mo, looking at the wagons, spoke his thoughts aloud. His young apprentice looked at him questioningly. Before he even sees his patient, he already knows what may be bothering him. A wagon with 2 horses pulled up to a house with a large gate. Above the gate that opened inward was a gold-colored plaque that read, Auntie Yi and Aju, standing in front of the opening gate, both looked at this inscription. An obliging young man came out to meet them. The young man introduced himself and began to sprinkle in pleasantries. Young Lee tried to nicely explain the reason why he didn't meet their city gates. Auntie Yi and Aju felt awkward. They didn't know what to say. Elder Wang got out of the cart and began to look at the young man. She was just dumbfounded when she realized who it was. This young man. Yang Li said her name in surprise. They started saying nice things to each other, not paying any attention at all to Auntie and her sick son. Yang Li became uncomfortable, and he sighed. He wriggled like a beetle, to hide his deception. He tried to apologize again for his disrespectfulness to all the guests, and asked them to follow him. Yang Li showed the place that was supposedly called the nurse's station. Broken glass, cobwebs on the window frame, cracked walls and dirt. Moss on the roof, battered shingles, holes in the roof in places. Auntie Yi was just mad as hell. Yang Li, with a smile, confirmed that the nurse's station was in good order and perfect for recovering health. He showed the condition of the kitchen, which had holes in the wall. He also emphasized the quality of food in the medical center. He also showed me the servants' quarters. It was in a terrible state. Dirt, insects, desolation. The young man then began to talk about the beautiful view and the proper layout of all the rooms. But here he suddenly showed a childish resentment, and he sincerely did not understand the discontent of the new guests. Seeing this, Auntie Yi felt embarrassed. She started to look for some excuse. Yang Li smiled slyly and supported Auntie's excuse. Senior Wang and Yang Li continued to exchange pleasantries with each other without paying attention to the others. Auntie looks on with a displeased look and speaks her thoughts aloud. And the little spirit confirms Auntie's words. An old man with a neat beard and mustache approached Aju. She gawked and gasped, and she was very frightened. Startled, she began to ask him loudly, waving him away. With an important look, Shaman Mo began to ask Aju. But he was called out by a young assistant who ran after him. The shaman's young assistant courteously began apologizing for the inconvenience, standing like a stooped woman in front of the old man and reasoning which made her eyes grow wider and wider. And he began to pester her sharply about her miraculous self-healing. She started to wave it away. She didn't understand. After all, events were changing so quickly, and what was even going on? Aju interrupted the shaman abruptly and explained her worries and problems clearly, articulately. Shaman Mo accepted her challenge. He enjoyed it. His professional excitement had kicked in. He started asking his aunt and all the details of the injury. He made a preliminary report on the trauma and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small clear vial. There was some kind of pink liquid in it. Shaman Mo carefully removes Shuan's bandage, applies a small amount of medicine carefully to the boy's open wound. The wound in front of his eyes begins to heal, and Shuan opens his eyes. Auntie Yi was very happy that her child had recovered. Shaman Mo stood beside them with a satisfied look. Smiling and pleased with himself, the Mo shaman looked at Aju. Aju looked at the shaman carefully and remained silent. Looking at her, Shaman Mo was just talking about medical practice. He was amazed that the little girl was able to recover from her ailment without help. He immediately tried to pounce on Aju to examine her in detail. And then I got hit in the head, hard and whiplashy, from his young assistant, which I stopped him in time and calmed him down. He began to justify his teacher and Mr. Shaman Mo to the little girl. In response, Aju smiled awkwardly. The young assistant took his old teacher and master on his shoulder, headed towards the exit of the hospital. She stared at the hospital exit and remained silent. Aju suddenly felt very sad and she called out to the little spirit. Meanwhile, Yang Li and Elder Wang weave their own sneaky intrigues. A young servant carries an old master on his shoulder. His face is unhappy. Almost everyone is smiling and happy because Schuan has recovered. That's the most important thing. There are 2 plates on the kitchen table, containing the simplest of foods and the cheapest, most unpretentious. And it doesn't look, for that matter, that good. On the 3rd plate, there is some orange lump sprinkled with something. It doesn't look like something appetizing and edible. Auntie Yi carefully picks up this food misunderstanding with 2 chopsticks, examines it squeamishly and asks. Yang Li, smiling slyly, began to praise the food placed on the table in front of the newly arrived guests. Pointing to a plate of some green halm, he called it a diet dish. As he approached the 2nd plate, the contents of which looked like some kind of biomass of a recycled kind, he began to tell me that it was special for the guests, and the cook was doing his best. Aunt Yi interrupted him with a gesture. She showed that he was boring her with his ridiculous stories. Senior Wang and Yang Li hurriedly left the nursing station kitchen, and the 2 of them headed in the direction they wanted to go. Aju glanced suspiciously in their wake, and she got up from the table and walked quickly toward the kitchen exit, trying to find out where they had gone. Pressing herself against the wall so she couldn't be seen, she watched the 2 men walk into the new room. From around the corner, she scrutinizes to see if anyone is around. The doors to the room remain open. Aju asks herself, what should she do next? What should she do? There are very appetizing dishes on the table, beautifully prepared, and Senior Wang praises her former pupil. Eating with great gusto, she gives him favorable instructions. With a sly and obliging smile, Yang Li answers her. Elder Wang warns him he must be very careful. As she sips her drink, she shares her observations with him. Yang Li, unable to contain himself, laughed loudly. And with the dangerous look of a sneaky snake, he said, there was an awkward silence in the air. There was an awkward silence in the air. Senior Wang nodded approvingly at him, and she too began to laugh in unison with her pupil. Overhearing this conversation, Aju became very upset. With an angry look, she said to the little spirit. The little spirit rejoiced. You can put what you've learned into practice. She was staring thoughtfully into the distance, thinking about her plan of action, and I saw a buzzing insect fly by. It was very small. The insect turned out to be a simple mosquito. It was unremarkable. It sat on the neck of the servant who was sweeping the path in the infirmary. The mosquito bit him and flew off somewhere. Looking at this, Aju asked the little spirit. He obligingly answered her, realizing what she meant. But then she suspected something wrong, and she tried to find some kind of trick. With an intelligent look, he began to explain to her what are the means of control and the level of energy expended. Pointing to Aju's biofield, its capabilities and powers, he gave her advice by looking at a spider and a mosquito. A perfect example. The basics of energy manipulation. Evening. The canteen of the infirmary. The light shines through the windows. All is quiet. Aunt Yi looks at her niece anxiously, not knowing what's happening to her. Aju quickly jumped under the blanket. She had wanted to sleep for a long time. Not understanding anything, Auntie Yi asks Aju, Already half asleep, she answered, getting ready to take a proper nap, and she gave good advice to her aunt, and rolled over to the other side. Auntie Yi frowned and thought to herself, well, let it be this time. Aju asked the little spirit, what can be done now? Wrapped in a warm blanket, closing her eyes, she smiles and falls asleep. Finding himself in some new space dimension, Aju looks around in bewilderment. Someone calls her name from behind, and she turns around, a little scared and confused. She'd never seen anything like this before. She sees before her a tall, statuesque man, with a blue face, white hair, a gilded monocle, and dressed like a nobleman. The man speaks leisurely, in a languid and confident voice. An awkward moment of silence for the little spirit and his young mistress. Shyly, Aju asks, I wonder if it's him. His appearance is so unfamiliar. Next, the little spirit starts goofing around and laughing. He starts bragging to his new mistress that he can do better than that. She asks with the bewilderment of a small spirit. Confidently, the little spirit answered her. Describe the new possibilities of the dimension they are now in. In it, the possibilities are infinite. Aju asked him trustingly, but the little spirit explained to her with a smart and important look. Aju's eyes glittered with happiness like stars. She began to praise the little spirit. Now in earnest, they got down to business. The little spirit, like a school teacher, took a pointer and began to explain everything in order. He explained to her the nature of her great capabilities. Aju immediately interrupted her teacher. She couldn't wait to just show off her godliness. And then as punishment, I got hit in the head with a pointer. He repeated to her again about the importance of energy balance. Now let's start the real training. Let's put our knowledge into practice. The little spirit explains to her by example. And she begins her exercises, diligently, following all the instructions. A is reaching her maximum concentration. Droplets of sweat appear on her face, and right beside her a huge ball of energy appears, pulsing with power and emitting a glow. The perfectly shaped ball makes specific sounds. The little spirit wondered, how did the mistress have such great potential? He made his conclusion by observing Aju's work. The little spirit encourages her, and tells her not to stop, continuing to explain for his new mistress the nature of strength and energy. He warns her that it won't be easy, but you have to try. But before she could finish her explanation, Aju walked over to the energy sphere and lifted it up in her arms. Smiling guiltily, Aju apologized to the little spirit. The little spirit exclaimed with delight. This was beyond all his expectations. He announced that today's training was over. Aju asked, but how does she get out of this dimension? The little spirit shows her the way out of the dream dimension, a simple door, and she walked leisurely to the door. Smiling thoughtfully, the little spirit concludes. With a loud sigh, Aju wakes up abruptly, sitting up on his bed. With great impatience, the little spirit bids the new mistress act immediately, and to demonstrate her new knowledge. A month in the night sky. Clouds float past him. You can hear the swaying of tree branches and the sounds of insects. A little spirit tells her what she needs to do, and Jeep swipes his right hand and a blue glow appears. This glow spreads like energy threads of bright blue color in different directions. One of these threads captured the first mosquito. Then the second mosquito, still holding on to control. And now there are already 16 pieces of insects under Aju's control. She says quietly to her insects. The mosquitoes flew at the open door. They found their prey in no time, and flew to it. Senior Wang barely opened her eyes. She woke up to a buzzing sound, and a terrible scream echoed throughout the estate. She starts counting energy. She sees the smallest insect and decides to start with it. Well, why not? It starts small. Then Aju found a bigger insect, a hornet beetle. Yes, it was quite massive, and needed a bit more energy to control it. But she definitely thought it was better to start with insects. Now she's switched from insects to animals. Here's a small bird, keeps doing the math. Aju pointed a finger at the horses and asked the little spirit for his opinion. The horses met her with a disapproving look. The little spirit reminded her to evolve. Talent is talent, but hard work is hard work. Out of the corner of her eye, she glances at the horses and realizes what they're whispering about. It's like she can sense their displeasure. She looks at the horses and remains silent. Her face is calm and unruffled. Her eyes are clear and pure. And then she makes the decision to get closer to the horses to get a better look at them and listen to what they are talking about. Literally 2 meters from the stables, she stops. The horses look at her intently. An awkward silence persists. She bows low to the horses and explains to them why she did what she did. The horses look at the girl in surprise, but one of them doubted the sincerity of Aju's words. Because after such control, the horse's health was not good. One of the driven horses defiantly expressed her disapproval and disdain. In response, Aju stared at the ground and kept her head down and remained silent and silent. She's trying to explain herself as best she can, so they won't hold a grudge against her. She took control and made them run at a gallop, not at her whim. Trying to make amends in some way, Aju walked in the opposite direction from the stables in search of provisions for the horses. The horses smiled. They liked this attitude, and only one of them was very dissatisfied. Aju returned very quickly with a rather large basket in her hands. Everyone wondered what was in the basket. Smiling, she shows that she has brought treats for the horses. Not much, but from the bottom of her heart. But the offended horse told Aju that she wasn't interested, and it was a matter of principle. And then she heard a crunch and the sound of food being chewed. She clenched her teeth in surprise. Her horse eyes grew even bigger. The offended horse began to yell at his fellow horses and resent them. He could not believe that the treats he had brought would be more precious to the horses than their principles and pride. But then, overcoming her pride, the offended horse condescendingly replied to Aju. And speaking for all horses, she granted forgiveness to the girl. Aju shared her observations with the little spirit. He was very intrigued. He liked her observations very much. She explained to the little spirit, "The basics of psychology will help better than the expenditure of energy, and you won't have to worry about wasting points anymore." Aju had a good idea about where to get extra points, and looked at the balance table. "It's a beautiful morning. The sun is warming the earth. Everything is blooming and smelling," Auntie E called out to her niece. The little spirit warned his young mistress of the need to have different options and not rely solely on one. "Shh." Aju looked at the little spirit and said to him, smiling, "The girl has really good ideas in her head," reasoning with her eyes closed, not seeing where she was going. Despite her feet, she hit her head on someone. A moment later, she began to consider the obstacle she had stumbled upon so unexpectedly. Elder Wang. Her face was just a horrible, puffy and swollen face. It was all artificial. She said hello quietly, and her expression didn't change because she was one big, puffy face. She was starting to get annoyed and really didn't like it. Aju grinned through her teeth with a sneer and anger. The Elder Wang went about her business, lamenting all the things that happened to her. Aju looks at her calmly without saying a word. Together they laughed at her, and Aju asked the little master whether it was worth it to go on like this. Laughing and laughing, paired with the little spirit, she didn't notice anything. Shaman Mo crept up behind her and asked her quietly. From surprise, she jumped up with the little master with fear and screamed. He crept up so quietly that he could not be heard. Shaman Mo said to Aju with a serious face. He looked very calm this time. He didn't lash out at anyone. The little spirit looked at Shaman Mo and his new mistress from the side. Aju sort of shuts him off and looks at Shaman Mo with distrust. But he had a good idea. After all, there's no need for knowledge, and you can't carry it around behind your back. The little spirit offered to his young mistress. Let's test Shaman Mo's competence. Allegedly, they have nothing to lose. Aju reluctantly and held out her hand to the shaman and told him, and clasped her eyes tightly, imagining that he was about to do something bad. In anticipation, Shaman Mo interrogated her. In fact, he did so that there would be no misunderstanding. The shaman takes his pulse and makes his initial judgment. His years of experience and knowledge help him to do so. At first, his pulse slows down, and he imagines mountains, snow, cold and bitter cold all around him. And then it rises rapidly, and he represents a volcano erupting, and flames devouring it. Shaman Mo stops the initial inspection and examination. He lets go of Aju's hand. Aju looks at the shaman and asks him curiously. The little spirit is also eagerly waiting for the head healer's answer. Based on his extensive knowledge and years of experience in medicine, he concludes that such a phenomenon is very unusual, and there can only be one reason for it. And Shaman Mo's eyes shone brightly. This answer alarmed both Aju and the little spirit. It was unclear what else to expect. Quietly, in a half-whisper so that Shaman Mo couldn't hear, she asked the little spirit. The little spirit thought for a moment. His expression became very serious. He went through his thoughts one by one. The awkward silence, smiling, was interrupted by Shaman Mo. He was trying to explain to Aju the uniqueness of her case. This, as a specialist, interested him greatly. He invited her to visit. The little spirit advises Aju not to miss this opportunity. She listens to his sensible advice. The conversation between them was interrupted by Shaman Mo's young servant. He was tired and out of breath. He ran as fast as he could to catch up with his master. Before he knew what was happening, the young servant began to apologize profusely for his master, knowing firsthand the kind of weirdness he was capable of. And then Aju said without hesitation, she knew that nothing bad would happen to her. She was sure of it. The young fellow, Shaman Mo's servant, looked at her with a very surprised face. Aju's answer surprised him very much. A clear sky, white clouds floating across it. The sun's rays break through the clouds, warming everything they touch. The woman calmly sweeps the yard. I try not to miss a single speck. I want everywhere to be clean. The servants gather medicinal herbs from the garden and keep an account of the harvest. They are very careful not to damage the fruit. In front of Shaman Mo, Aju and the young assistant, a massive gate opens inward. A beautiful gilded inscription can be seen above the gate. They reach the city's main hospital. Aju opened her mouth in surprise. Never in her life had she seen such a large, well-maintained place. Everywhere was clean and tidy. Shaman Mo begins to speak with a strange intonation. His neat mustache retains its fine shape. Suddenly, he's staring at Aju with an obsessive gaze, to find out the secret of her recovery as soon as possible. And at the same moment, he was hit on the head again by his young assistant. So much so that he lost consciousness. The young assistant introduced himself to her. He gave his name as Ji-bai. Walking together in the well-maintained garden of the medical center, Aju and Ji-bai were having a nice conversation. They were very engrossed in the conversation. He explained the reason for his master's behavior by saying that he was trying to finally overcome the disease that Aju had. He explained the reason for his master's behavior by saying that he was trying to cure Aju. Looking at the clear sky and the gentle sun, breathing in the fragrance of the herbs in the garden, memories came to Ji-bai. He recounted the period when the whole country had suffered a great sorrow. Shaman Mo treated people selflessly, trying to alleviate their suffering. He desperately searched for a way to get rid of the disease. And the expected happened. He himself, exposing himself to the constant risk of caring for sick patients, eventually became ill too. But still he was able to find a cure and defeat the terrible disease. In gratitude for this, the emperor decided to elevate him and reward him generously and keep him at court. But Shaman Mo refused. He preferred the court to the city's main hospital. Ji-bai explained to Aju that sometimes his master gets carried away with his eccentricities, so he helps him to maintain his good reputation and decorum in the eyes of society. After listening carefully to Ji-bai, Aju contradicted him. Ji-bai's gaze was filled with question and surprise. Such people fascinated Aju. People who are selfless, dedicated to their craft, who work mainly for the good of others, not for themselves. Shaman Mo, coming to his senses, interrupted this pathos monologue. He said that everything was not exactly as they said, but thanked them for their kind and warm words. And then he clutched his head and began to shout that how could he be a great doctor and listen to praise if he could not penetrate the mystery of the simplest things. Puzzled, Aju asks Ji-bai, and he, smiling, answers her politely, realizing that she doesn't know the ins and outs. Ji-bai continued his story about how his master Shaman Mo had found a miracle plant and discovered its very useful properties, so he made it into a medicine. But then, unexpectedly, faced with the fact that the composition of the drug changes itself, and with it, its properties change. And this mystery is driving Shaman Mo crazy. And Ji-bai explains that the deadline is burning up the medicine is to be delivered to the emperor's troops. And it's not hard to guess what failure will follow if the job isn't done on time. Aju turned to the shaman, and he shifted his gaze in her direction with a displeased face. With hope in her eyes, she offered to help the shaman by holding her hand near her heart, showing thereby the sincerity of her intentions. In response, Shaman started yelling at her as if he had been doused with a bucket of boiling water. Ji-bai calmly stood up for Aju and suggested that the shaman accept her help. After all, he has nothing to lose. With a dissatisfied look and silence, Shaman Mo looked at both of them. He realized that this was a waste of precious time. Though reluctant, he arrogantly agreed to accept Aju's help, and told her to follow him. However, you'll have to follow a very fast pace, and at the pace that Shaman Mo chooses. Aju and Ji-bai looked at the quickly fleeing Shaman Mo in bewilderment. Dust flew out from under his feet. Smiling calmly, Aju asked the little spirit to follow her instructions. I felt stronger, lighter in my body, and extremely agile. Reaction increased, and with it, confidence in my own strength. Aju launched from her seat straight up like an arrow just released from a bow, almost as instantaneous and swift. Looking at this picture, Ji-bai snickers and shouts after them. His witty joke is really true. Ji-bai stands alone and stares at the empty hospital courtyard. He remains silent. It all happened so quickly. Then realizing abruptly that he was alone, that Shaman Mo and Aju were already far ahead, he suddenly cries out. He runs after them with all his might. Ji-bai jumped out of the gates of the city hospital, right in front of the general and his 3 soldiers. The general asked the servant where he could find Shaman Mo, and here, recognizing the general, said that he had recently left the walls of the medical facility. With surprised eyes, the general looks at the servant, going over the options for the shaman's whereabouts. The sound of a bell, the one that's so etched in his memory, and he can't forget it. The general looks at Ji-bai running away. His running makes the dust pile up. The general and his 3 soldiers, not realizing what is even happening, look puzzled and remain silent. Shaman Mo stopped, quite exhaled, praising himself. The run was very good and the distance was beautiful. Aju, out of breath and sweating from fatigue, is just catching up with the shaman, and he begins to reprimand her. Aju complains to the little spirit that she is very tired, but she can barely stand on her own feet. She left all her strength on the road while she was running. The little spirit ponders why his new mistress didn't come first to the top. Everything seemed to have been done for her victory. He was very curious as to why the gray-haired old man was radiating such energy and was able to bypass his young mistress. Something's not right here. After recovering a little, Aju asks Shaman Mo to take her to the place for which they came straight from the city hospital. You can see mountain peaks that seem to reach all the way to the clouds. At Shaman Mo's, the competitive spirit is undaunted. A new challenge is a new race. Aju can't believe that it's necessary to reach a new place again at the same pace. The flower is beautiful. It shimmers with azure blue colors. It looks like it's made from a piece of sky. So small and so amazing. Shaman Mo is showing Aju, "This is what we came here for." The two of them look at the growing flowers beneath their feet. Aju angrily grabbed Shaman Mo by the scruff of the neck and started shaking him in a fit of rage. He naively told her that he just wanted to stretch his legs. And then she looked thoughtfully at those flowers again. She experienced a sense of déjà vu. She had definitely seen them somewhere before. And then she saw the image of the leader of the Silver Wolves in her mind. A fierce, strong, dangerous, but still noble predator. She scrolled through the memories of how she had put a bandage on his wound, and how the blue wildflowers had come in handy for the bandage, and remembered the reaction of the wolf leader to what he'd said to her. Aju asked the little spirit to help her, as quickly as possible. His quickness and knowledge were needed. The little spirit began the task immediately. He also asked for some time, and hinted that any additional information regarding these colors would be useful to him. Aju asked the shaman about how he had found the flower. With a thoughtful look, Shaman Mo began to reminisce. He told how he and his young assistant Ji-Bai went to collect medicinal plants. Suddenly he smelled food. He was probably very hungry, and his strength needed to be restored. A little while later, when the sun was down, he came across the tent of the hunters and they kindly invited him to share the evening meal. Both Shaman Mo and his assistant Ji-Bai were very hungry and were eating their dinner with great appetite. One of the hunters remembered the good deeds done by Shaman Mo and said good things always come back. The four of them sat around the fire. And watched the flames as they added more wood to the fire. Suddenly, one of the hunters got his hand badly burned. He started screaming in pain and waving it around a lot. Shaman Mo wanted to offer him a potion to quench his pain, but he refused. The hunter knew another remedy, in exchange for asking the shaman for help with something else. Because you can't gather much on your own. But two is much better. Gathering, not far from the fire tent, a full armful of bright azure blue flowers, they returned. Shaman Mo and Ji-Bai saw a picture they didn't understand, which confused them. One hunter took and applied an indigo flower to the wound on the arm of another hunter, and the life-giving juice of the flower began to work. Looking at each other awkwardly, Shaman Mo told his assistant that it was time for them to leave. But the assistant, in order not to be rude in the eyes of the hunters, tried to reassure his master. Literally after a short period of time, the hunter with the burn showing his hands smilingly says that everything is fine, nothing hurts. This struck Shaman Mo very hard. He had never seen such a thing before. It was beyond his comprehension. The hunters told him in great detail what the flowers were for, where and when to pick them. They're like the best medicine. Looking at the hunter's fully healed hand, he felt as if he had been electrocuted. He had an epiphany. It was as if he had been working on a problem for a long time, and the solution had come to him simply and ingeniously. He picked the best flowers in the clearing with his eyes. He grabbed the biggest handful and plucked it from the ground. He told Ji-Bai that he had to go to the hospital immediately. The young assistant looked at his running teacher and couldn't understand anything. He only exclaimed, returning quickly to the medical center. Looking at the flowers he had picked, Shaman Mo, and made another discovery. After a long time and a very large number of attempts, his discovery was about to become his personal victory as a healer. But at that moment, General Dwan knocked on his door and asked for help in making medicines for the troops. And Shaman Mo blithely agreed, saying that everything would be done on time. There's no need to worry. But no matter what he did, extending the properties of the indigo flower did not produce results. He tried literally everything he could think of. The combinations were unimaginable. Aju calmly began to reason about the flower's properties, looking at Shaman Mo wailing and screaming while holding his hands on his head. Frowning, Aju asked herself. At this moment, she was as focused and attentive as possible. Suddenly, the little spirit said that his new mistress's task was done. It was very quick. He had done his best. A holographic panel with the characteristics of the indigo flower and the soul-soothing flower popped up in front of Aju's eyes. In this case, the characteristics of the soul-sedative flower are highlighted in a special way, and the structure, chemical formula, and cycle of life. Aju tells the little spirit his speculations, and the latter approvingly confirms their correctness. With a smile, Aju utters. She is calm and pleased with herself, feeling her superiority. She informs the shaman that she has the solution to the indigo color problem, and we need to get back to the medical center. After her, the angry Shaman Mo yells out like a madman. It was probably his pride that was bothering him. Because a simple child, a simple girl could find a solution to such a difficult problem, while he, a famous healer, could not. Smiling cheerfully, Aju reassures Shaman Mo and tells him not to worry. There's no reason for him to worry. Shaman Mo looks at her with a look of disbelief. All sorts of thoughts rushed through his mind, and doubt crept into his mind. Aju gives step-by-step instructions, where to start, all the ingredients, nothing extra. Add another ingredient to the bowl. It should not be lumpy. It should be well crushed and free of impurities. Shaman Mo and Jibai stand still and listen to her very carefully. It was as if they were apprentices themselves and she was their chief mentor. Aju is shining with happiness. She's so happy holding the vial of green liquid in her hands. Shaman Mo, holding onto his beard, asks the girl incredulously, patting himself on his neat gray beard. Getting his hands on the vial, he looks closely at the medicine, but wonders where such knowledge comes from. Aju asks Shaman Mo a question, looking at him carefully, trying to understand his reaction. And then he is told in detail about such a concept as symbiosis and what it includes, and smoothly moves on to an explanation to the indigo flower, who needs a soothing flower. Next, she points to the proportions. How many calming flowers it takes to save one indigo flower, and end up with a green-colored medicine. It's also important to keep in mind the effects of the drug's constituents, Aju noted. Jibai stands stone-faced, wondering to himself, how is this going to end? He thinks that maybe his master is very uncomfortable, and wonders if he needs moral support at this moment. Shaman Mo burst out laughing loudly, unimaginably joyous. He agreed with Aju's reasoning. But this laughter frightened both Aju and Jibai. With surprise, Aju looks at the holographic panel. There's a new arrival of glasses coming in. She realizes with exhilaration that Shaman Mo has appreciated her knowledge and help. She had worked so hard. Then Shaman Mo calmed down and said with reverence, he knew how to appreciate other people's talents. After all, it's impossible to know everything. He bowed tactfully to the girl and asked for her help. Her natural ingenuity and inquisitiveness, but Aju hesitated and hesitated. She waved her palms nervously. Shaman Mo's bow made her very uncomfortable, citing that she might upset her family and loved ones. This is the best excuse and reason for her refusal that she could think of. Shaman Mo immediately commanded Jibai. He ran as fast as he could to carry out his master's instructions. With a stone face, Shaman Mo asked her again. He really wanted her help in preparing the medicine. With a satisfied look, Aju confirmed. And with her, the little spirit nodded along with her. Seeing the efforts of Shaman Mo and his servant Jibai, she couldn't refuse them. The little spirit watches the conversation between his new mistress and the Empire's first healer. He is pleased that Aju is gaining important new knowledge. He says to himself that he will achieve his goal and will overcome any obstacle. The sun is beaming its gentle and warm rays, warming gently everything around with its life-giving light. It was a beautiful morning, clear skies, fluffy green everywhere. Birds are singing and clouds are passing by. The roof of the medical center is visible. All three were simply exhausted from the night's work. They had not labored all night, but they had accomplished what was required of them. Aju was exhausted and had big bags under her eyes. The only thing she wanted to do was to rest. A cloth was spread on the floor, and on this cloth were 25 bottles of the first batch of medicine promised to the general. Aju walks out of the building like a sleepy chick and tells everyone. She walks a little swaying. Her tired legs can barely hold her up. Shaman Mo, exhausted from the night's work, thanked her and immediately fell into slumber. His venerable age immediately makes itself felt. She walked out of the gates of the medical facility and past her. General Dwan and his soldiers rode by on horses. Walking down the road with black circles under her eyes, she asks a little spirit to help her during her next workout. A bell rang, a clear, soft sound, like rock crystal. It's impossible to forget. General Dwan heard it, the same sound as in the woods by the lake. He remembered that his savior had a bell like that. He quickly turned his head back to see where the ringing was coming from. The horse stood still beneath him. He saw a little girl and it hit him. The thought flashed through his mind like an arrow. He turned his horse sharply in the opposite direction of the town road. The wind blew past Aju, and she couldn't understand what was happening, what it was. He asked curiously, expecting an answer from the sleepy little girl. The soldiers also turned their horses around and watched her carefully. The girl looks simple. She doesn't stand out. Aju looks at him with sleepy eyes and doesn't understand what he wants from her. She remains silent. She's very tired. General Dwan asks her. He looks at Aju without taking his eyes away. His bright blue eyes glisten. Squinting one eye, General Dwan looked at Aju and asked. And she stared at him, not knowing what to say. She had no thoughts. She was so tired and wanted to sleep. In a half-whisper, Aju asks the little spirit if General Dwan can remember everything that happened. He doesn't even realize who inflicted such a severe wound that nearly killed him. His memories are probably fragmentary. She looks at him. She's getting a little uncomfortable. He doesn't look very friendly in her eyes. Quietly, embarrassed, Aju began to answer, and her cheeks turned red, and she lowered her eyes downward. And then quietly she continued talking, and her face began to burn even more. She just didn't know what. Just in case, she pretended not to understand anything General Dwan was saying. Suddenly, she began to shuffle her feet quickly and switch to a sprint, thinking up a reason for her quick exit as she went. She turned down the alley and hid behind the wall of the house so no one could see her. It looked funny from the outside, though. The soldier started asking the general, seeing the very unusual behavior of the little girl. The general replied calmly. He really wanted to find the one to whom he owed his life. But I guess it wasn't meant to be. He was holding part of the bandage his rescuer had left to cover his wound. General Dwan instructs his soldiers to take orders. An order is an order that must be obeyed. Walking into the gates of the hospital, Aju says to the little spirit. He just remains silent in response. She walked into the courtyard and saw a strange picture in front of her eyes. Jong Lee and Senior Wang were standing and talking. Senior Wang complained to her apprentice about the terrible pains and nasty insects. Jong Lee didn't know how to help her. Her face is completely covered with bite bumps. It's terribly swollen. There's not a living thing on it. Aju asked the little spirit how come the insects continue to follow her instructions, and the little spirit told her. He winked at his new mistress and smiled slyly. So much for Senior Wang's business for her bad behavior and attitude. Aju wanted to continue her studies quickly, and was getting ready for bed, which pleased the little spirit. Once again in the dream dimension, she can't stop marveling at everything she sees. Looking around, left, right, up, down. The new mistress is trying to find the little spirit, and calls out to her. She turned back at the sound and crackle. It was as if a small bolt of lightning had skipped and struck the lightning rod. And I saw my creation that I left here after the first time I practiced. It hadn't changed a bit. Not waiting for the little spirit, Aju wanted to continue practicing on her own without his hints and guidance. A little while later, the silhouette of a healthy spider appeared behind her. But she was working with the energy ball and didn't notice anything. She is focused and painstakingly working, ignoring the spider that approaches from behind. At the last moment, she caught a glimpse of him. He was huge, all wool and disgusting paws. There was a heavy thump and a scream. Aju didn't realize what was happening. Fear gripped her arms and legs. The little spirit decided to give his young mistress a good scare. So he decided to play a cruel joke on her, but then warned her that it was, in fact, him in the shape of a large spider. A severely startled Aju asked in disbelief. Then with all her might she struck him with her fist with angry screams. With a large bruise on his face, the little spirit began to justify himself, and explained the reason for his transformation. Aju asked in surprise about the reason. She was so frightened that her heart nearly gave out. Pointing to the energy ball, the little spirit explains to her. It's all about her skill and good abilities. This time he would teach her how to create a special kind of energy control, multiple objects at once. Casting her eyes aside due to squeamishness, she asks the little spirit to reincarnate into something more sympathetic. A bright flash and that was it. The transformation was instantaneous. That's not possible in the dream dimension. The little spirit is back in the form of a cute butler, and they begin classes immediately. Shaman Mo is rummaging around in the library. He stands in front of a large shelf of books and tries desperately to find something. Looking left to right, he asks himself. He jerks his head in frustration. He doesn't like wasting his time looking. Finally, having found what he needed, he exclaims. On the topmost shelf, he sees a special book with a black binding and a gold band. He picks up the ladder and carefully places it close to this book on the top shelf. Shaman Mo climbs up the ladder, pulls out this book. Holding it in his hands, he begins to wail. There was no rag nearby, so he began to brush the dust off the book with the sleeve of his clothes. Smiling, he prepared a surprise for Aju, a worthy gift for a girl with such talents. Jibai finally finds his master in the library and asks Shaman Mo to go to dinner. Despite his eccentricities, he takes care of the old man. Shaman Mo turns his head toward his assistant and says he's about to join him. I'm coming down the stairs. He steps carelessly on a step and accidentally hooks his foot on the ladder. Jibai hears a terrible cracking and rumbling sound. The noise of falling stairs and books. The mayhem and disorder was terrible. With a satisfied face, Shaman Mo, holding the very book he has been looking for so long, walks towards the exit of the library, with the ladder and scattered books lying on the floor behind him. Jibai asked him when he was near the exit. The old man clutched the book tighter to himself. Cursing, the head healer replied to his apprentice. That talent and effort should be well rewarded. This is a gift for little Aju. It will help her in her quest and learning. Therefore, the source of knowledge must be reliable. A measurement of dreams. A small boat in the middle of white water. 2 fishermen with rods and tackle are fishing. The sky above with bright stars and glow. Aju asks the little spirit with displeasure and misunderstanding. Where does the white water in this dimension come from? And then the little spirit takes a bite. He makes a swift hook to his prey and pulls his catch out of the water. He pulls the fish into the boat. The fish is still fluttering, and he begins to explain in his new mistress. Then he adjusts his fishing hat. With 2 hands carefully spreading, he takes in the fishing net. He adjusts the weights, and he throws that net with all his might into the water, as far away from the boat as possible, and it spreads itself out in the water. The net is indeed large and could easily fit 5 or 6 fishing boats. The 2 of them stare at it intently. The little spirit, smiling, explains to Aju. She listens to him with surprise and attention, and then slowly starts pulling the net closer to the boat, and with a sharp motion, pulls the net with a large number of fish out of the water. Fish fluttering in the net. There's a lot of them. A good example for a young hostess. Staring in surprise at the caught fish, Aju begins to realize what the little spirit is getting at, and then she wonders what she should do next. I'm sure there are other ways. And then the little spirit holds out a large spider on his blue palm to her. It sits quietly on his palm. Aju jumped up and down with a scream. She was really scared. The spider scared her a lot. The little spirit explains to his mistress that the principle is the same, and a spider is well able to teach it. Quickly calming down, she grasped the main point. She looks at the energy ball she was working with earlier, and a thought flies through her mind. Aju introduces a little spider who starts to make his web. It all starts with simple outlines. Here is the first part of the web finished. The basic outline is outlined. Now circles are starting to appear all over the web, one step at a time, carefully without making any big gaps. It's all set. She's standing in the center of an even symmetrical web of energy, which she controls herself. She is overjoyed at what she has accomplished. The little spirit encourages her and praises her. The little spirit, smiling, asks Aju. His Leo is full of benevolence. Looking carefully with wonder at her palms, Aju realizes that her worldview has changed. Her eyes sparkled like stars. She's as content as a child. She thanks the little spirit profusely for his help and explanations. Suddenly, Aju felt something sharply. Her eyes opened wide. Something rolled across his body. She told the little spirit that she sensed something. Some kind of intruder. Like an alarm went off. And by energy structure and component begins to describe these people. She can see the entrance to the hospital, and she also describes the speed of these people. Aju insists that she needs to wake up as soon as possible. Coming to her senses after a nap, with her eyes closed, she sees an inscription just like in a computer game. Opening her eyes, she saw Shaman Mo's face in front of her. Who asked her? Aju screamed in fear and surprise at the whole hospital. The roof of the hospital jumped. Aju started yelling like crazy at Shaman Mo. Her anger was unstoppable. Just a little bit more, she would have attacked him with her fists. Shaman Mo calmly listened to her and replied. Jibai came up from behind. He was out of breath from running. Still, grimly dissatisfied, sitting under the blanket and hugging her legs, she asked him again. He began to praise her, telling her of her remarkable latent abilities. At the end of all his compliments, he proposes to her. His offer was very tempting. The little spirit, watching this conversation from the sidelines, ponders the usefulness of Shaman Mo's suggestion. And he likes it. Smiling slyly, he thinks Aju shares his point of view. With a disgruntled, angry look, she looks at the shaman and refuses. Shaman Mo was just out of his mind with rage. It's as if he's been struck by lightning. And Jibai, smiling, thinking to himself, realizes the reasons for her refusal. Smiling at the little spirit, Aju utters. With a cheerful wink, she points her finger to the air, happy and proud. Jibai asks his master a question. Watching Aju, coughing into his hand, Shaman Mo speaks calmly. His mustache is as flawless as ever. He holds out a cloth bundle to her and says it's for her. With astonishment, holding the book and cloth, examines them and asks. The inscription on the book showed. The book itself looked expensive and rich, with a gold ribbon. You could see the value of it was great. Jibai was simply shocked by what he saw. For a moment he was speechless. He recognized the book. He interrogated his master, whether he was sure he wanted to do it, explaining to the gentleman the value of the book he gave him. Besides, it's the only copy. Shaman Mo interrupts Jibai and explains the reason for his decision. Knowledge is not a privilege. It must be shared. Next he turns to Aju. She, sitting on the bed with the book presented to her, listens to him attentively. With a satisfied look, squinting his eyes, the shaman tells her. His face radiates warmth. The words he said surprised her. It was in her eyes. She didn't know what to say in response. As he leaves, Shaman Mo also warns of his absence from the city. He also advises Aju to wear a new suit and come to his pavilion if she changes her mind. Looking at her with the corner of his eye, Shaman Mo says he'll be waiting for her. Satisfied with the gifts, Aju looks after him and says to the little spirit. Sitting on the bed, she scrutinizes the book and consults with the little spirit. But he says that extra knowledge is never superfluous. The two of them look at this book and familiarize themselves with its contents, looking in detail at the images and inscriptions. Auntie Yi, together with Shuan, brought breakfast for Aju. The smell of the food is very pleasant. She asked her what happened to Shaman Mo. She found his behavior very unusual. Aunt Yi saw him leaving Aju's room and noticed how upset he was as he left. His assistant tried to cheer him up. The little spirit speaks to his new mistress, and she confirms what he has said. Aju warned Auntie and Shuan that she would be back quickly now. She tells the little spirit how much she wants to learn in this life. The little spirit specifies what kind of knowledge she is interested in. After all, there are so many fields of knowledge. And then behind her, she hears Elder Wang wailing and complaining. She is walking slowly somewhere with something in her hands. Aju turned her head, looked closer, and saw her with a pot in her hands. Her face was horrible, covered in bites and boils. It was literally devastating. You couldn't look at it without crying. Aju's little spirit hid around the corner of the building and watched her, so that Elder Wang wouldn't notice them. She set the large pot on the ground, saying, running her hand deep into a hidden pocket of her clothing, and pulled out a suspicious white bottle. It had a skull on it. The contents of this bottle, Senior Wang began to pour the contents into the pot she had brought. A vicious grin appeared on her bitten face. There was a chicken with broth in the pot, and drops of poison were dripping down its body. The poison was white in color. After a little while, Senior Wang began to stir the poison together with the broth, so that nothing could be seen. Taking a pot of poisoned chicken in her hands, she slyly began to rehearse her speech, with a face full of kindness and hospitality. Looking at all of this, Aju quickly asks the little spirit how big the reach of her energy network is. Concentrating, she calls for insects. Abruptly opening her eyes, she gives the command. No hesitation. She's as focused as possible. The energy grid spread out as far as it could, calling all the mosquitoes in the area to fulfill Aju's instructions. Part of the swarm showed from around the corner. With astonishment, Senior Wang looks on and shrieks. There are more and more of them. The swarm is enormous. The mosquitoes buzz, creeping inexorably towards their prey. Senior Wang realizes that the whole giant swarm is flying towards her. The swarm of mosquitoes swoop down on her mercilessly. Terrified, she screams an inhuman scream. She lets go of the pot of poisoned food. The pot falls to the ground and shatters. Shuan and Aunt Yi are saved from being poisoned. Two servants are talking in the courtyard of the hospital. They may be men, but they look like women in their demeanor. Holding a broom in his hands and sweeping up the garbage, one says to the other that he saw Elder Wang running around the grounds of the infirmary, with a swarm of mosquitoes rushing after her. Eventually, the swarm completely engulfed her from head to toe like a black abyss, and the servant tells of how Yang Li came running to rescue his tutor. He quickly commanded to shelter Senior Wang from the mosquitoes. The two servants continue to gossip amongst themselves, without noticing the assistant manager. Suddenly, Yan Li shouted at them. For a moment, they were stunned. With a disgruntled face, he dismisses them and tells them to get off the nursing station grounds. Angry, he stands there thinking, and all sorts of thoughts pop into his head, mostly bad ones. He looks at the entrance of the room where Senior Wang is resting. He wonders where he can find qualified medical help for his caretaker. A large bed with a cover. Walking up to Elder Wang Yang Li's bed, bowing, asks her. She's feeling really bad. She turns to him and tries to say something to him, but it's hard for her. Then overpowered, she says she's very tired. She's all terribly tempted by a swarm of mosquitoes. Red blisters cover her hands and her face, and she can hardly speak. Sighing, her pupil replies. His hands are down. He feels his powerlessness, and he adds that he will help her in return for her request. The sight of his teacher makes him very sad. It was a clear, sunny day. A one-horse carriage pulled up to the gate of the nursing station, and Yang Li helps Elder Wang into the cart. Senior Wang is lying in the bed of the wagon. She can see that she is suffering unbearably, but in her heart she realizes that she has received all this by her deeds. The carriage moved and went to its destination. Yang Li looks after it. He scrolls through his memories in his head and begins to analyze. Yang Li was able to notice something unusual as he watched Aju. At first he couldn't believe his eyes. Saw a little girl telling mosquitoes who to sting. At that moment he remembered well the stony and ruthless expression on the little girl's face. I couldn't believe my eyes. This is something no ordinary person could do, much less a little girl. Yang Li asks himself the ultimate question. It's a very unpleasant and uncomfortable question, but the answer must be found. He followed Aju all the way to the nurse's station cafeteria and overheard the conversation. Yang Li felt fear. He is alone. He needs to be very careful. Any wrong move and his position would be jeopardized. He finds in his head one single solution to all his problems. Two rich gentlemen, a woman and a man, are sitting on a lawn, under a large covered umbrella. Green grass everywhere and delicious grapes on the table in front of them. The servants were tending the crops in the beds and pulling weeds. Yang Li ran to his aunt and uncle with all his legs, and out of breath he told them everything as it happened. Everything he had seen with his own eyes and all his speculations. Uncle laughed, remembering that nothing had changed from when Yang Li was a little boy. Jong Lee bowed to his uncle in reverence and explained that he couldn't solve all of this on his own. Jong Lee's aunt, while eating sumptuous grapes from the table, made a remark to her nephew. Uncle, confidently grasping the handle of the expensive chair, stands up saying, "If the reason is serious and the nephew's words are true." Auntie and Uncle Jong Lee get up and prepare to go to the nurse's station with him, to sort out all the problems. Imagining a fishing rod in her head with a line and hook, Aju agreed with the little spirit. Then she visualized the energy net as a spider's web and the fish caught in it. Sitting at the dining room table, she mentally practices with the energy grid. At this point, she can control any animals in the area of the medical facility, or can communicate with them and hear the same things they do. Aju can hear the conversation between the two servants while looking at them with the eyes of a bird. The little spirit turned to its young mistress. What did she think of all that was happening now? Suddenly, she remembered about the previous manager of the nursing station, Yukai Fan. I also remembered his son, a young man of good looks and well-educated. However, Tinkai Fan did not take his father's place, no matter how hard he tried, because De Jong Lee beat him by stealth. He was good at scheming and backstabbing. Cheetah Lee had no children, so they raised their nephew as their own son, everything they knew and could do. They passed all their skills to young Jong Lee, and now he's misusing all that knowledge. Aju and the little spirit reasoned together. They concentrated and closed their eyes. The little spirit gives his young mistress some very valuable advice. And valuable advice, as they say, is always worth its weight in gold. There are other ways to get them on your side, and influence them, so to speak. Aju was angry at the little spirit, not fully understanding what he meant. In response, the little spirit began to yell at her furiously. After calming down, Aju still didn't understand what the little spirit wanted from her, and he begins his instructions on the energy of the human being. But still, Aju's abilities can have a pretty good effect on a person. Not as much as on insects and other animals, of course, but human beings can be influenced to a certain extent, and Aju can. Aju stands with an evil look, all covered in bright blue flames, looking at the stranger who is terrified. Good analogy with the fish that got caught in the net. And with a satisfied look, the little spirit finishes his instructions to Aju. Aju stands there with a puzzled look. He doesn't know what's going on. And then he replies briefly, which makes the little spirit faint. Gathering the little spirit again, first tries to explain to her. His patience was at an end. He looked menacingly at his young mistress and asked. Smiling foolishly, she also asks the little spirit to help her with advice when talking to Cheetah Lee, after all. Aunt Yi looks at Aju and she sits with glassy eyes. Shuan is teasing his cousin. She looks funny in his eyes. Suddenly, Auntie E is knocked down by Madame Lee. She screams and falls. Auntie and sigh. She probably twisted her leg when she fell. Next to her is little Shuan. She starts talking to Cheetah Lee in raised tones. Trying to justify his courtesy, De Jong Lee laments the large number of cases. With a swing, Auntie Yi hit the chair stand with her fist. She started screaming like she was out of control, blaming the nurse's station manager for the disgusting conditions. Auntie said she could endure any conditions, but the children didn't deserve such bestial treatment. She gets angrier and angrier and tells De Jong Lee not to forget who he really is. Hissing through his teeth, De Jong Lee reluctantly told her. You could see his dislike and disdain. Looking at Auntie Yi with the gaze of a venomous snake, he continued, trying to hide behind high-minded speeches from his aunt's anger. He tried to give away the filth in which his guests lived, and the slop he fed them for their faithful service. Auntie was boiling like an erupting volcano with anger. Shuan tried his best to calm her down, but Auntie was undeterred. De Jong Lee is an experienced schemer. It was not for nothing that he got the manager's job by his cunning and sneakiness. Jong Lee watches his uncle and aunt and admires their agility. The little spirit tells Aju to get started. It's like a call to action. Aju is determined to teach Cheetah Lee a lesson. The moment of truth has arrived. Let's try our best. De Jong Lee and his wife looked toward Aju with disdain. Covered in a thin energy flame, Aju began to act. Cheetah Lee sensed something was wrong. Something had gone wrong, not according to their plan. They began frantically covering their faces out of the blue. At the sight of the little girl, Auntie Yi's niece's little girl, they hesitated, confused. De Jong Lee looked at her in surprise. To him, this was unthinkable. Smiling, Aju didn't show any bad emotions or any negative attitude. But nevertheless, De Jong Lee was simply uncomfortable. He tried to pull himself together and concentrate. De Jong Lee started to give answers to the questions. It is difficult for him to calculate the moves in this verbal altercation. Observing this, Aju sees the results of the impact. They accumulate like an avalanche. After finishing listening to him, she asked about the very first hospital manager. Responding to her, De Jong Lee wondered how such a girl could have such information. After all, not many people know about it. Watching this sweet conversation, the little spirit rejoices. She's got good skills. She's a pleasure to work with. He smiles sweetly, realizing that his new mistress is a very fast learner. Aju continues the verbal altercation. Aunt Yi and Shuan look at her, and she makes the verdict that the current nurse manager is unfit. He cannot maintain the condition of the premises and the quality of the food at an appropriate level. She also brings up the previous manager's son. She even says that he is quite good with himself and diligent. He will be a worthy replacement for De Jong Lee. In response, Chitali laughed in little Aju's face, but she only smiled and said they didn't realize where the request for a replacement would be sent. It's about Mr. Luo's adult son, to whom Aju is like a loving sister. De Jong Lee blurted out uncontrollably, "How dare you threaten him?" To which Aju found something to reply. She was calm and sly. It's not often you see her like that. But in doing so, she added a very valid argument that there was nothing to interrupt. Chitali wrinkled his nose a little. It smelled fried for them. They could lose everything. De Jong Lee was frantically going through his thoughts in his head. Nua Jung easily threw him off balance without letting him gather himself and concentrate. She put De Jong Lee in a very uncomfortable situation. No matter what he does, his position is threatened. The little spirit prompts its young mistress to strike now, and she agrees with him without delay, without torturing him with silence and long waiting. Chitali became nervous and hesitated. They realized what kind of trouble they were in. The little spirit tells Aju that she has won, but that she should be merciful to them. Auntie and Uncle Yang Li stood confused, exhausted, and all sweaty with excitement. Forget everything and start fresh like it never happened. With a friendly face, Aju says to De Jong Lee in a soft but unforgiving tone, his career and position are in her hands. De Jong Lee fell to his knees in front of her. It was as if someone had piled a mountain of bricks on his back, and bowed low to her, apologizing for any inconvenience. Smirking, Aju is pleased with herself. She has won. It's clear to everyone. Suddenly, Yang Li heard a voice from his Auntie Li. "Free passage to the street from the infirmary. There is no one in the open door." Yang Li appeared out of the blue, realizing everything perfectly, he said. Without hesitation, Aju told the nurse's station manager that they were moving to a better new room immediately, and expect better conditions in everything. Bowing red, Li says it will be done, quickly removed. The little spirit was very much pleased with his mistress's success, and praised her. Little Schuan ran up behind her and hugged her, as tightly as he could. He started praising his cousin so much. He couldn't contain his admiration. And then she saw the first credited faith points. With a question in her eyes, Aju looked at the little spirit. Suddenly a bell rattled on her chest. She touched it and it glowed with a bright yellow light. Holding it in his hands, it glowed brighter and brighter, but the light was soft and yellow. She thought to herself as she looked at Shuan. This was the first time she had succeeded. And Shuan, smiling, was glad to be next to his cousin. Dream Dimension. Aju and the little spirit are sitting opposite each other with a large pillar of light rising between them, giving off a soft yellow glow. Aju asks the little spirit what that glow is. He explains to her that the power of faith has just such a radiance, and it is quite tangible. The pillar of light had a bright yellow base and glowed like a golden base. Aju was a little surprised that all those glasses she had collected were of that size. With doubt in her voice, she asks the little spirit. The little spirit calms her down and tells her not to worry. She was a little wary when she heard his answer. He changed the subject and promised to answer her question. Next time at a more appropriate moment, Aju asks the little spirit again. Looking at the pillar of light with incomprehension, the little spirit answered her that it was a definite scale. And then the little spirit remembers how sick Aju was before being healed with his humble help. Explaining further, the little spirit told where the scale came from, and outlined the next goal for the two of them to accomplish. The little spirit says his life's mission has a clear framework. Aju asks him and what happens after he's done. The little spirit remained silent. Giving an honest answer was not something he wanted to do. I could tell. He quickly turned to Aju and smiled, because earning faith's points was a very difficult thing to do. Aju was understanding of his answer. She glared and blushed. She said she would not be in a hurry to part with the little spirit. The little spirit was shy and cried a little. Calming him down, she said they had a lot of work to do together. After calming down, the little spirit asked Aju a specific question regarding the kind of knowledge she needed. She responded immediately, and it was completely predictable. Standing close to the pillar of light and the energy ball, she also wanted to acquire other knowledge that related to energy. Aju also wanted to learn hand-to-hand combat. Unexpected for a little girl. Asking her, the little spirit looked a little embarrassed, touching his monocle. She remembered the case of General Dwan, his training and his strength, and she wanted to have the same. Aju started waving her little arms merrily. Once seated at the keyboard and monitor, the little spirit gets to work. Looking with curiosity, Aju asks him, such a strange object and so bizarre looking. The little spirit answers her with bravado, that it is a marvelous machine for knowledge. Right now the water data is being processed. Next comes a table with graphs and scales. The requests of the young hostess that she is interested in are entered here. Hands in white gloves quickly thumbed over the keys of the keyboard. A menu with the following message appears. An incredulous Aju asks the little spirit after reading the name of the new profession. The little spirit calmly describes the term to her. A giant enormous cat with green eyes appears, and a mysterious figure of a girl embraces her. Next, the little spirit tells Aju that there is a special group of specialists who are on the very outskirts of the Empire. With happiness, she glowed, asking the little spirit for help, to start training as soon as possible. Regarding medicine, you'll have to work hard every morning, Aju, and learn everything useful. And then Aju pictured herself in an army uniform, with boots swinging her legs around and practicing moves left and right. And while sleeping in the dimension, she will be practicing energy management. The little spirit warns his young mistress that labor will have to be done every day. He makes an approving sign, smiling brilliantly. It's clear to see that he likes what he sees. Aju asks to be taught how to use this mysterious computer. There is a teleportation of knowledge using charisma points. Aju sits down at the computer, and the little spirit, smiling, walks away. After a while, the little spirit starts yelling at Aju. It's not good to spend so much time on the computer. The new roof glistens in the sunlight as if it had just been laid. The doors are clean and well-maintained, made of good, expensive wood. Doors do not creak and close smoothly. The shutters on the windows and the furniture in the room are all new. It smells freshly renovated everywhere, and clean. The new apartment for Aju and Auntie Yi and Shuan is ready. Aju nods approvingly and praises the manager. He lives up to her expectations. De Jong Lee obligingly nods back at her and says, afraid of incurring her sudden anger. She smilingly accepts his speech and lets him go in peace. He leaves very quickly. Joyfully, she jumps in place out of happiness. Aju shines like a star and rejoices in the fruits of his labors. The little spirit reminds its young mistress of the class schedule. Auntie E calls her to breakfast. The food on the table smells wonderful. Smiling, the little spirit tells Aju to go get some refreshment. Gratitude to the little spirit. Aju knows how to appreciate being treated well. The basics of human anatomy begin. The basics of basic medicine, not without them. The little spirit is just snapping at the little one. He's very angry with Aju because she can't remember once and for all which bone is which. For some people, repetition is not the mother of learning, but the mother of stuttering and wasting time. With floating eyes, Aju complains to the little spirit that she's having a hard time. With all the rigor of a teacher, the little spirit says it's the basics of the basics without it. There's nowhere to go without it. Holding a bowl of soup in his hands, Aju smiles and promises to work harder. Auntie Yi looks awkwardly at her niece, and is constantly having interesting thoughts and hunches in her head. She can't understand what's going on with this girl, and it scares her. I mean, she's worried about her. The study continues. The little spirit repeats his question to the young mistress again. The morning is so clear. Blue sky, white little clouds floating on it. The birds are singing. It's so warm. You can hear the wind rustling and the smell of freshly cut grass. Aju is walking in the garden of the nurse's station and thinking to herself. Not far from her, a fly landed on a tree. She hadn't expected the little spirit to be so demanding. Aju looks at the piece of paper. It shows her in her army uniform. The little spirit warns its young mistress. It's combat training time, and she's not glad she started it all. She looks at a piece of paper and on it is a drawing of Aju in an army training uniform. After looking at it, she tosses that piece of paper like trash just onto the path. Aju walks toward the exit of the infirmary, thinking of where to get a uniform. She's being followed by Auntie E, trying not to draw too much attention to herself. She picks up this piece of paper with care and scrutinizes it carefully, looking after his niece holding this piece of paper. Out of the sadness in her eyes, she looks again at her niece who is leaving. Auntie is looking at Aju's drawing. She's never seen an outfit like this before. She smiles and thinks to herself. Quirky fantasies her niece has about clothes. Her unusual behavior both pleases and alarms her aunt. And sometimes she doesn't understand her at all. I mean, she's changed a lot lately. But Auntie proved wise in her judgment. Looking at the paper itself and the writing on that paper, she understands everything. Looking up into the sky, Auntie turns to her late sister. Looking at all this serenity in nature, she makes a promise to herself. The silence in the forest is interrupted by a sudden question. And then the little spirit starts yelling at its young mistress, making it clear that something doesn't come from nothing. Further making a stern look, he shows a holographic table of basic strikes and moves. Aju begins to practice and train with determination. Learning the first strike, a little spirit demonstrates the basic moves. The elements of impact are shown in the complex on the hologram. With rigor and seriousness, the little spirit explains to Aju that this is a valid fighting system. Concentrating and attentively studying the picture, Aju agrees with the little spirit. Gaining positivity, she says it will all work out quickly. With no consolation, the little spirit gives his verdict that one must have a talent for sports. Aju is persistent in her endeavor. Unyielding. She has a strong character. Then she looks at the small spirit and doesn't know what to do next. He chides the landlady for ruining a hard-to-find workout uniform for her. And then they start yelling at each other with mutual complaints. Then she heard a familiar voice. In the middle of the deep woods. It surprised her. It was Auntie's voice. And she was very glad to have found her niece. Once again, you can see the strangeness in the niece's behavior. It's just that Aju is very shy. Auntie looks at her very affectionately and holds something out to her. Aju picks it up and begins to scrutinize it. She is surprised to realize that this is what she needs. Auntie has tried her best and sewed with her own hands what she needs. And Auntie, looking at her from the back, finally realizes why her niece has been so shy and covering herself with her hands. Joyfully, Aju asks Auntie how she guessed. There are voices in the forest. Aju measures the form. The mold fits like a mold. Couldn't be better. Just like a warrior princess when I was a kid. With a joyful face, Aju thanks her. She looks at her gratefully. Auntie hugs her niece with warmth and love, holding her in a caring embrace. She tries to show Aju that she's worried about her, and points to the pot of food she had prepared especially for her. Close and loving people are the most important and great wealth of a person in this world. Aju felt the warmth of her embrace and looked at her aunt. She cried dramatically and apologized to her. Wiping her niece's tears, Auntie reassures her. The main thing is that she is safe and healthy. Auntie leaves and asks Aju to come back as soon as class is over. She's very welcome at home. Little Two tells his young mistress with good envy that she is very lucky. Someone is quietly watching from the shadows of the trees behind Aju. No facial features are visible, only a silhouette and a focused gaze. The holographic table shows the scores for the steps taken. The result is not perfect, but acceptable. Aju is tired, barely catching her breath, listening to the little spirit, but he cheers her up. As the table on the holographic panel showed, she had reached the minimum level and could move on. And then Aju was drawn to wise words. Her familiarity with the internet and the computer in the dream dimension really did her good. More sweat, less blood is a proven principle. Hard in training, easy in battle. With her determination and perseverance, the young mistress greatly pleased the little spirit. Looking at her from the outside, the little spirit appreciates these traits of her character. Compared to her successes and endeavors, some of her shortcomings can be overlooked. And then he heard the words of the young mistress. She drew him abruptly away from his thoughts. Smiling awkwardly, she hints to the little spirit that she wants a refreshment. She needs her strength. Not much time had passed. The lunch break has passed. The sounds of practice can be heard in the woods. Aju demonstrates good execution of the elements of the punch. With dedication and concentration, a hologram with the points scored is displayed. Perfect execution, nothing to fault. Aju is happy that she did it, and little spirit is happy with her. She sits next to a stone and an empty pot of food. She's eaten all of it, and she's resting. The little spirit shows the next element of the kick. The sequence must be observed. Looking at him, finishing the food Auntie had prepared, Aju is confident that it's easy to handle. The little spirit corrects her and tells her to look carefully at the instructions. There are no subtleties to miss. With her eyes closed, she inhales the air, clears her mind of extraneous thoughts, and swiftly strikes, precise and sharp, as it should be with all the subtleties. The holographic table shows the scores. The result is pretty good. The advice of the tutor, the excellent manual, give their result. She is very happy and radiant that she succeeded on her first try. She is not hopeless for martial arts after all. The little spirit looks at her and begins to assess the usefulness of training in the dream world. There is a sharp bang. The noise caused the birds in the forested area to fly up from the tree crowns. Another blow and there's smoke. The ground shakes beneath her feet and Aju feels it. Her senses are heightened to the extreme. She mentally tries to prepare for everything. Another bang, harder, and the smoke is coming in harder. Either someone's doing a gunpowder test, or they're trying to blow up something very massive and strong. With astonishment, they both look at the place where the blows came from. The little spirit didn't utter a word either. He could not give his young mistress any data. The tree fell to the ground with a thud. As it fell, it kicked up a tremendous amount of dust into the air. An indistinct little dark silhouette is visible. But behind the big cloud of dust and smoke, it's so hard to see it. It was little Shuan's cousin. He stood there looking surprised at his fist, which was emitting smoke. And there were a couple of scratches. When she got a good look at her little brother, Aju shouted very loudly. She was frightened and ran as fast as she could to her cousin. She looked at both the fallen tree and her little brother. She began to examine and run her hands over the most likely places of damage to her brother's body from all sides. And asking if he was all right, Shuan started to explain to Aju what he was doing here. But he still couldn't fully understand what had happened to him. Aju grabbed his hand and began to examine the scratches. Holding him tightly to her, realizes that the little boy may have lost his speech from the painful shock. Immediately commanded the little spirit to analyze the damage. The little spirit reassured her. There's no need to worry. Nothing dangerous. A few scratches were no reason to panic. She exhaled a sigh of relief and calmed down. It was like a weight lifted off her shoulders. She'd been so nervous. And then wondered in amazement. How did he manage to do that? The little spirit hadn't encountered anything like that either and remained silent. At that time, Aju asked the little spirit to perform a thorough scan of Schuan. Very quickly, a holographic table analyzing physical and mental parameters appeared before their eyes. Everyone was very surprised by the strength parameter. It was really just very high. How is that even possible? Aju asked herself. It's just a little 4-year-old boy. After the gene solution, her strength also increased, but not that much. The reason for such incredible strength is a mystery. Shuan looks at them thoughtfully and remains silent. Judging from his gaze, he is not hiding anything.